Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I would like to begin by saying how delighted I was to be invited by the RSA to give the inaugural RSA Tindale Lecture in memory of the late Patricia Tindale, and to be able to thank her family for their generosity in founding the lecture series. Throughout her career, Pat Tindale wrestled with the challenge of improving the quality of design in the public realm, and by doing so, she of course had a positive influence on the lives of millions of people. Many of the values she championed in architecture are the ones I cherish in that field and in other areas of design, and that's one reason why I'm so happy to play a small part in celebrating her achievements now. But another more personal reason is, of course, that Pat Tindale was a woman, making her one of the very few influential British architects of the late 20th century. So back to the issues that preoccupied her throughout her career. Design, whether it's of a building or anything else, is an inextricable element in the development of every aspect of society and our daily lives, making it one of the most important forces in determining their quality. But most people, of course, don't see design like that. Typically, they confuse it with styling or typecast it as a commercial ploy to trick us into buying things of questionable value. And if they were asked to describe what design can contribute to society, they'd probably understand what architects can do, because that's easy, designing and building schools and hospitals. But they may well suspect that other areas of design were limited to maybe designing logos or nice brochures explaining what specialists from other disciplines had decided to do. And the problem with this is that by restricting design to such narrowly defined roles, it risks depriving us of one of the most powerful tools at our disposal to create a fairer, more productive society. But the confusion about design is wholly understandable. It's a complex, often elusive phenomenon that's changed dramatically over time by adopting different guises, meanings and objectives in different contexts. But its elemental role has remained exactly the same. Design is an agent of change, which can help us to make sense of what's happening around us and to turn it to our advantage. And none of us can avoid being affected by design because it's absolutely ubiquitous. We can't escape it, even if we wish to. All we can do is try to determine that its impact on us will be positive rather than negative, and to do so successfully, we need to understand it. So how do we ensure that society uses design for better, not worse? One solution is to demonstrate its potential, and thankfully there are lots of empowering design projects that do that. And I'm going to start with a couple of historical ones. The first is John Hawkesworth's 1823 engraving of the Vigilante. This was a French slave ship that was captured by the British Navy off the coast of Africa. And this drawing helped the anti-slavery campaign to expose the horrific conditions in which African slaves were being transported to North America. Simply by drawing this in the dispassionate style of an architectural drawing, Hawkesworth brilliantly demonstrated the brutality of the slave trade. And equally effective were these. This is one of Booth's poverty maps of London, which were compiled in the late 1800s by Charles Booth, a wealthy Liverpudlian shipping magnate and an anti-poverty campaigner. At the time, the squalor of London's slums was a national scandal, and Booth's fellow anti-poverty campaigners were claiming that 1 in 4 Londoners were living in intolerable conditions. He suspected that this was an exaggeration and decided to ascertain the facts. So he assembled a team of volunteers to visit every street in London to assess the income and social class of its residents. And after analysing the data, the team determined the socio-economic status of each street. They then assigned different colours to signify the status of the street. A black street, and you can see a couple of them there, was occupied by what was called the lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal, whereas the people on dark blue streets, and again, there are lots there, were just plain very poor. And the luckiest Londoners lived on yellow streets, like Booth himself, because he lived in plush, leafy Kensington. The project proved that the scale of poverty in London had been underestimated, not overestimated, and as a result, the government stepped up its efforts to clear the slums and to replace them with decent housing. Now, the most important component of Booth's work was the rigour of the research. Had it not been absolutely accurate, the project would have had no impact at all. But this design decision to colour-code each street ensured that the information relayed by the maps was readily understood by a far wider audience than the few people who'd have ploughed through an academic tome on the subject. So one final historical example, and it's this. It's from the early 1900s. This is an exhibition in Vienna with materials supplied by the Isotype Institute, which was founded by the Austrian political scientist Otto Neurath as an information design project to explain complex social, economic, political and scientific issues to the many, many people who still had difficulty reading and writing. Neurath was convinced that pictures could explain even the most complex ideas more effectively than words, and he assembled a team of researchers and analysts, including his future wife, the mathematician Marie Reidemeister, to identify which symbols were needed to produce a comprehensive visual language and how to combine them. He then commissioned artists, including Gerd Arndts, to draw them. So, for example, a lawyer was represented by the scales of justice, a farmer by a scythe, and a striking worker by a clenched fist. And the symbols were used to describe all sorts of phenomena at the time: urbanization, economic development, the demographic differences between different countries, and in the 1930s, their relative readiness for war. Now, you can see echoes of the work of Isotype, Charles Booth and John Hawkesworth in many social design projects today. And I'll begin with the most conventional one that Pat Tindale would have recognized, because it's the design of a school, except that this particular school was so imaginatively designed that it's become much more than a space for learning. It's the Bridge School in Zaxi in China. And Zaxi is a tiny, isolated, 450-year-old village in the Fujian region of southeastern China. Some 700 people live there, mostly on low incomes. And as a result, like much of rural China, Zaxi, here it is, has fared very badly during the economic boom because its younger residents left the village to move to towns and cities in the hope of being employed by the factories there. So it was left with dilapidated and derelict buildings. And for centuries, for 450 years of this village's history, predictably, the villages on one side of the river have absolutely loathed the villages on the other. So there's a long history of conflict between the two. So when a Beijing-based architect, Li Zidong, who knew the area well, having studied nearby, was commissioned to design a primary school for the village, he decided to give it a double role as a way of tackling Zaxi's identity to resolve its historic problems. But Li designed the building in the form of a bridge, and here you can see it literally fords the river, so it joins the two historically hostile halves of the village. So not only has the Bridge School given a dying village a sorely needed resource, by symbolically joining the two sides of the river, it's healed historic wounds and given the villagers confidence in the future. It's even boosted the local economy because so many architecture buffs have come to the village to see the Bridge School, that a little cafe has opened there, the first they've ever had. This really is an extraordinary architectural project that has transformed a village and how the local community sees it. So now I'm going to look at a public sector initiative to improve the quality of life in a different place by applying design in a very different way. And it's the Cycle Superhighway in Copenhagen. Now, many cities have, of course, recently introduced programs to try to encourage people to cycle rather than using cars or public transport, but none of them have been as ambitious as Copenhagen. When the superhighway opened last April, the city already had a good network, being environmentally minded Danes, of cycle lanes, and half its residents already cycle to work or school every day, which is much, much higher than most other places, but not high enough for the Copenhageners. The Danes decided to create nearly 300 kilometres of dedicated cycle paths through Copenhagen. Now, there were some conventional design interventions. the design of solar-powered lighting to illuminate the paths at night, the design of footrests and tyre pumps, which are placed a mile apart, the design of conversation lanes so you can safely cycle two abreast if you want to chat with a friend. But most of the design work was strategic, identifying the correct routes without paralysing other road traffic, synchronising traffic lights to prioritise cyclists, and critically negotiating the interests of the 21 local government departments involved in a programme that could cost up to £90 million over the next decade. The first route opened in Copenhagen last April, and the second one opens next month. Eventually there'll be 26. And the research so far shows that for every 6 miles cycled instead of driven, the city saves £3.5 of carbon dioxide emissions and 10p in healthcare costs. And you can see how that will rapidly mount up. So I'm now going to move on to two very different examples of designing for society, which were initiated not by the public sector, like the Superhighway and the Bridge School, but by entrepreneurial social designers who conceived, planned and executed them, and even fundraised so they could deliver the projects on their own terms. And the first is a strategic intervention in education, and it's Studio H, which is an experimental design course run by two humanitarian designers, Emily Pillerton and Matthew Miller, in a high school in Windsor, Bertie County, one of the poorest rural regions of the United States. It's a deeply problematic area with a history of racial tension and freak weather, where 1 in 3 children live in poverty and the few available jobs are lowly skilled in agriculture and biotechnology. And Emily and Matt's plan was to run a design course for 17-year-olds at a local high school, intended not to prepare them for careers in design because there aren't enough jobs locally for them, but to nurture skills in problem solving, communication and innovation that they can draw on for the rest of their lives. Now, both Emily and Matt are in their late 20s and had worked on humanitarian design projects before. Emily and Matt wanted to go back to working within a community on a grassroots basis, so they moved from San Francisco to Bertie County to do so at Studio H. They raised the money to set up and run the course for 2 years from various charities. And on day one, when Emily asked the students what was the last thing they'd made, maybe a cake for their mum or a birthday card, most of them couldn't think of anything. Half of them had never held a hammer in their lives or knew how to read a ruler. Now, the plan was that they'd start simply by designing and making boards for cornhole, a local game. And by the end of the first term, 10 students had completed the assignment, but 3 had left the course. The remaining students designed and made the chicken coops in their second term, which required more sophisticated design and making skills. When floods destroyed large parts of the town, they were donated to the worst affected families. So the first 2 terms were intended to prepare the students for their grand finale in the third term, which was designing and building a farmer's market for the town. And this was a 2,000 square foot wooden pavilion in an empty lot on the riverfront. One of the students had come up with the idea of creating a farmer's market where local people could sell homegrown produce. The students researched what sort of market would work best in Windsor and identified suitable vendors. And at the opening ceremony, the Mayor of Windsor presented a key to the city to the whole team at Studio H, Emily and Matt and their students. After the school year, several students went on to college, many of them the first members of their families to do so, or trained to pursue a trade they discovered at Studio H. Emily and Matt ran the course there for a second year, then moved back to Northern California to re-establish it in Berkeley. And they continued to receive letters and emails from their students in Bertie, affirming that their experience of Studio H transformed their own expectations of their lives and also their relationship to the local community. So my next example of design strategic engagement with society is closer to home and on a very different scale. And it's a project developed by Participle, a social design group based in southeast London, founded by the social scientist Hilary Cottam. Now, Hilary discovered design while she was working for the World Bank in Africa as a development economist working on water projects. She realized that one of the most important factors in determining whether the project succeeded or failed was the quality of their design. So she decided to find out more about it. She experimented with new ways of using design to address the kind of social problems that had been tackled by social scientists like herself and economists, not by designers. and set up Participle, whose objective is to redefine the welfare state by making it fit for purpose. Southwark Council commissioned Participle to design a better support service for elderly people in the borough that critically could cost no more than the existing one. And they began by talking to local seniors, and their research showed that the most important ingredients for a happy, healthy old age had little to do with money, but were ensuring that each person had a social network of at least 6 people to whom they spoke regularly, and had no need to worry about niggling problems like fixing a leaky tap or replacing a broken bulb. And their solution was to create what they called a circle, in which elderly residents of the same areas would belong. When a new member joins the circle, somebody is sent to meet them to assess their needs. So, for example, it could be a man whose wife has died and she had done all the cooking, so he doesn't know how to cook. They will arrange for another member of the circle who can cook to give him some basic training. And if, say, and I hate resorting to gender stereotype here, he's good at doing accounts, they would find somebody who needs help in that direction. So critically, the members of the circle don't just accept a support service from it, they also contribute. It sounds like common sense and seems so simple that it's astonishing that no one thought of it before. But what, you may ask, does it have to do with design? Well, a lot, because designers were involved with every stage of developing the concept. Each team was led by a designer, adhered to the design process and used design language. And that's because Hilary Cotton believes that designers have excellent instinctive communication skills that help them to squirrel out information from people. Designers are also strong on lateral thinking, or tend to be, which was helpful in developing the idea of the circles and deciding how to deliver them. And their communication skills also proved critical in raising funding, nearly £1 million to prototype the concept, and finally to persuade the local seniors to try them out, even though a lot of them were initially very sceptical. Now, the circles have been introduced all over Southwark and have proved so successful there that they've been introduced by 12 local authorities in different parts of the UK. But Hilary admits that one reason why they've been given the opportunity to tackle these problems is because of the crisis of confidence within the social sciences. So a sudden willingness to experiment with other approaches, including design. So if we look at Participle and Studio H and what they have in common, there are 3 things. Firstly, there's a determination to apply design for the good of society. Secondly, they interpret design in its broadest strategic sense as a process of change management and a series of skills to be applied in different contexts. Thirdly, they have the entrepreneurial drive to do so in developing new ideas and the strength and the chutzpah to realise them. And critically, they also have access to digital technology, which, say, Studio H used to raise funding and awareness, and Participle does to manage complex data, thereby enabling them to work much, much more ambitiously. And there are, of course, many more designers who are equally determined to work in a similar way for the good of society in the way that Pat Tindale did, and there's no shortage of challenges for them to tackle. Helping us to live more responsibly and sustainably, reinventing dysfunctional social services, redressing the tragic imbalance of resources that leaves so many people with too little and the rest of us with more than we need or want. Now, I'm not going to pretend for a moment that design is a panacea for these problems, far from it, but it's a very powerful tool to tackle them, provided it's deployed intelligently. And the more we know about design, the greater our chances will be of using its power wisely, just as Pat Tindale strove to do throughout her career and would doubtless wish us to do now. Thank you.